Brent Maddox is finally facing accountability, but not in the way he expected. He's not worried about the misconduct charges. What really has him fuming is who is overseeing the trial. Judge Vanessa Rhodes, a black woman with an unimpeachable record. From the moment he steps into that courtroom, his frustration isn't just visible, it practically fills the air. He doesn't believe someone like her should be judging someone like him. And as the case unfolds, that frustration grows, quiet at first, then louder, until one day, in front of a packed courtroom, Maddox loses control. And what happens next leaves the entire city stunned. What unravels isn't just one man's arrogance, but an entire system that shielded him for years. And Judge Rhodes, she's not about to flinch. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's episode takes this even further. The Charleston Federal Courthouse stood like a monument in the gray morning light. Inside, the tension was almost physical, thick, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Courtroom 2B hadn't been this full in years. Staff who didn't need to be there stayed anyway. Journalists filled the press section, phones off but cameras ready. Even the bailiffs were standing straighter than usual, eyes always on the man at the defense table. Judge Vanessa Rhodes moved through the East Corridor with a calm that wasn't practiced. It was earned. Nearly 20 years on the bench, and she still walked like every step meant something. Not because she had to, but because men like Maddox expected her to trip. She passed two whispering clerks by the stairwell. They went silent as she neared. She didn't acknowledge them, not out of pride, out of habit. Inside, Maddox sat back like he was riding in a squad car, arms folded, legs spread, taking up space like he owned it. His suit looked borrowed, tight across the shoulders and short at the wrists. His attorney leaned in and whispered, "Keep your mouth shut today. No comments, no attitude. Let me do my job." Maddox barely turned his head. "You act like I'm on trial." "You are on trial," the lawyer snapped back under his breath. "One more outburst and you're out of chances," Maddox scoffed. "If she were a real judge, we wouldn't even be having this performance." "Brent," the lawyer warned, "let it go." One of the bailiffs subtly shifted, hand near his belt, watching Maddox like he was a storm cloud about to break. He didn't need to say much. The way he held himself, the way others reacted, it was clear. People were waiting for something to go wrong. Then the room stilled. The door behind the bench opened, and Judge Rhodes entered. Her robe flowed with purpose, her steps steady. She didn't glance at Maddox. She didn't need to. She scanned the gallery, gave a small nod to the court reporter, then took her seat. The creak of the wooden bench beneath her was the only sound, and even that seemed out of place. "Court is now in session," the bailiff called out. She lifted the gavel. One sharp strike, not loud, but final. "Good morning," she began. "We'll resume testimony from yesterday. Is the witness present?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor answered as a woman approached the stand. The forensic analyst adjusted the microphone and began her testimony. She was composed, precise, laying out a case built on details, radio records that didn't match official reports, data gaps, timing inconsistencies. It all pointed to one thing. Officer Maddox's version of events wasn't just flawed, it was falling apart. He shifted in his seat, leaned forward. "Lies," he muttered, just loud enough for the front row to hear. Judge Rhodes looked up, calm, focused. "Mr. Maddox," she said, "you will remain silent during testimony." He sneered. "With all due respect, how am I supposed to sit here and let this happen?" "You are here to listen," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Your counsel will have a chance to respond shortly." He scoffed again. "Yeah, like that'll matter." One of the bailiffs moved, just a step, but Judge Rhodes raised a hand, not for silence, but to keep the room steady. She didn't need backup. Not yet. The prosecutor continued. She asked about the body cam footage. The analyst explained how key sections were missing, likely altered. Maddox's jaw tightened. "She's guessing," he said louder than before. "She wasn't even there." Want to know how this ends? Because what Maddox does next forces everyone in that room and across the country to ask one question: how many times has this happened before? Subscribe now and be ready for the next chapter. It only gets deeper from here. The moment Judge Rhodes leaned forward, still seated, her voice calm but unwavering, the entire room held its breath. "Mr. Maddox," she said evenly, "this is your last warning. Interrupt this proceeding again, and you will be removed." That shut him up, outwardly at least. But the look he gave her wasn't obedience. It was challenge. His eyes locked on the judge, and though his body was still, there was something brewing underneath. His fingers tapped on his thigh, his leg bounced once, then froze, and his breathing had changed. Judge Rhodes noticed it all. She didn't show it, but she saw it. And she didn't feel fear. She felt ready. She'd seen this kind of silence before. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that holds a fuse, waiting for someone to strike the match. When the witness stepped down, she glanced at the clock. "We'll take a 10-minute recess," she said, and brought the gavel down once. The echo rang like a countdown. As the courtroom slowly emptied, voices low and nervous, Rhodes remained seated behind the bench, her gaze steady on Maddox. He was smiling, but not the smile of someone amused. It was the smile of someone who believed he'd already won. She rose without a word and returned to her chambers, expression unchanged, but mind racing. Not because Maddox scared her, but because men like him always assumed the system would bend under pressure. What they didn't understand was her. When the courtroom began to fill again, the air was no longer curious. It was tense. Even the reporters weren't just here for the headline anymore. They could feel something coming, something unspoken, but close. Maddox was already back in his seat. He hadn't moved an inch during recess. His hands rested flat on the table, but every few seconds, one finger twitched, like it wanted to grab something. His lawyer returned last, tugging at his tie like it was too tight. He leaned down. "You're going to speak only when addressed," he said in a low voice. "Let me handle this." Maddox didn't even look at him. "She thinks she's clever," he muttered. "She's a federal judge," the lawyer snapped. "And if you keep this up, she's going to destroy you without saying a word." Maddox gave a dry snort. "We'll see." Judge Rhodes re-entered with the same poise she always carried. Each step was deliberate, her robe brushing behind her. She took her seat, scanned the room with a glance that measured everything without saying a thing, and spoke. "You may proceed with cross-examination." The defense attorney rose. His questions were tight, clearly rehearsed. He tried to poke holes in the analyst's earlier statements, timeline confusion, procedural mistakes, interpretation errors, but none of it stuck. The witness was steady, her answers sharp and composed. Each attempt to discredit her only made her testimony seem more solid. Maddox didn't like it. He started shifting in his seat again, mumbling low enough to be missed, but the tone was there, bitter, personal. When the analyst brought up the altered footage again, Maddox let out a dry, deliberate laugh. It echoed. Judge Rhodes looked down. "Mr. Maddox, you were warned." He leaned forward, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm not interrupting. I'm reacting. Big difference." Her expression didn't change. "One more remark, and you'll be removed. That is final." Maddox sat back slowly, folding his arms, a crooked smile playing on his face, like he was in on a joke no one else understood. The next witness was called, a former colleague, a sergeant, someone who had filed an official complaint against Maddox years ago. Even Maddox straightened up. "Sergeant Diaz, You filed an internal report in 2019, correct? The prosecutor asked. Yes. And what was the complaint? I documented an incident involving excessive use of force, Diaz said plainly, and I reported that the body cam footage submitted at the time had been altered. Later, I was told there would be no action taken. Do you recall who reviewed that footage? Yes, the same investigator from Internal Affairs who resigned in 2021. Maddox shook his head, muttering again. This is garbage, he growled. Mr. Maddox, Rhodes warned, sharper this time, but he was already shifting forward, louder now. No, this is a joke. That man hated me. Everyone knows it, and now you're calling him credible? You are out of order, the judge said, voice firmer, eyes steady. The prosecutor paused. The sergeant froze mid-sentence. I should have known, Maddox continued, voice rising. The second I walked into this room and saw who was on that bench, this whole thing was fixed from the start. Tension crackled through the air. Reporters were scribbling fast. Bailiffs were bracing. One of them even took a step forward, but Rhodes raised her hand, not for silence, for control. She was still in charge. You want to talk about bias? Maddox said, now laughing, though it sounded hollow, like something was unraveling. Let's talk about yours. Every decision you've made in this case was to bring down the white cop who wouldn't play along. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Mr. Maddox, Judge Rhodes said once more. Her voice had no force behind it, no anger, only control. This is your final opportunity to compose yourself. He stood. The gallery gasped. A chair scraped back on the floor, loud and sharp. You think I'm scared of you? And in that moment, the courtroom wasn't just witnessing a trial anymore. It was watching a mask fall off, and a truth no one could unsee. Subscribe to see what happens when the line is crossed and someone finally pushes back. Maddox snapped. You think that robe makes you better than me? I've worn the badge. I've bled for this city. And now you want to put me on display? Humiliate me for the cameras? Judge Rhodes didn't flinch. Sit down, she said simply. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step forward. You don't get to sit there and act like you're above me. You never were. Court officers began moving, slowly, cautiously. The gallery froze. Maddox's lawyer raised both arms, voice tight with urgency. Brent, sit down. This isn't the way. Stay out of this, Maddox snapped, eyes wild now. I should have handled this my way from the beginning. That was the moment Rhodes saw it. A subtle shift, a movement that wasn't just frustration, it was intention. One hand drifting toward the inside of his coat. The tension in his posture snapping into something sharp. She didn't speak. Not yet. Because what Maddox was reaching for wasn't a rebuttal, wasn't evidence, and it certainly wasn't regret. It was something else entirely. There was a sound, quiet but unmistakable, a whisper of fabric, a subtle metallic click, the kind of noise that means nothing on most days, but in this room, at this moment, it cut through the air like a warning. She already knew what was happening before she saw it. Maddox's hand came out fast, not panicked, practiced. In it was a compact black handgun, chosen not for show, but for silence and speed. He lifted it slowly, deliberately, like this was always part of his plan. The room didn't move, not yet. There were gasps, a cry. A reporter dropped her pen. A court clerk froze. Bailiffs stepped forward, hands near their belts, but stopped. Because one wrong move could turn a courtroom into a tragedy. Maddox raised the weapon, aimed it at the bench. Don't move, he said. Calm, but far too loud for what should ever be said in a courtroom. Still, Judge Rhodes didn't lean back. She didn't touch her desk or reach for a button. Her hand stayed visible, her gaze fixed on his. "You brought a weapon into my courtroom," she said evenly. "I brought the truth," Maddox spat. "The kind you people keep trying to silence." "Put it down," one of the officers said. His voice quivered. "Shut up," Maddox barked, swinging the weapon a few degrees toward the sound, then snapping it back to the judge. "You think I won't use it?" he said, voice trembling beneath the rage. "You think I haven't been pushed far enough? You've already lost," Rodas replied, voice calm as ever. "Every second you hold that weapon only proves why you're sitting at that table." "No!" Maddox shouted, pacing now, moving slowly before the bench, like a man reclaiming some illusion of control. "You don't get to stand there and judge me. You act like I didn't serve, like I didn't sacrifice, and now I'm the problem? That's what this is?" "You made that choice," she said, her voice quiet but anchored. "No one forced it. You call this justice? You think this wasn't fixed from the start? Putting someone like you in that chair?" And then a pause, a silence so full it pulled the air from the room. Rodas didn't react. She didn't lash out. She simply looked at him and said, "You're afraid." Maddox stiffened. "What?" "You're afraid," she repeated. "Afraid that without the badge, the uniform, the title, you have nothing left. You're not standing there for justice. You're standing there because the version of your story you tried to build collapsed, and you don't know who you are without it." He raised the weapon slightly, jaw tight. "You think I won't do it?" "I think you already did," she said, eyes locked on his. "The moment you lifted that weapon, you proved everyone in this courtroom right. You didn't lose your job because someone targeted you. You lost it because you were never supposed to wear that badge in the first place." "Shut up," he snapped, but she didn't. "You call this strength? Threatening a room full of unarmed people? This isn't control, Mr. Maddox. This is collapse, and I won't help you disguise it as anything else." He was breathing heavier now, eyes darting, finger twitching just above the trigger. His gaze jumped from the gallery to the officers, from his lawyer, still standing, hands raised, to the judge who hadn't flinched once, and then he looked back at her. "You think words can break me?" She didn't blink. "I don't have to. You've already broken yourself." That hit something deep. His face twisted. Not rage, not yet, but something raw, unstable, like the mask he'd worn for years had finally cracked. He turned toward the gallery, weapon still raised. "Everyone on the floor," he barked, and suddenly the fear that had only whispered before now roared to life. But this story, this trial, it wasn't over. Not yet. People slid quietly from their benches. Reporters shielded their cameras. Attorneys ducked behind tables. Court staff crouched out of sight. Fear crept into every movement, silent, sharp, and shared. One of the bailiffs reached slowly under the desk toward the emergency alarm, but a single look from Judge Rodas froze him in place. Not yet. Maddox stalked forward, the weapon in his hand now more like a symbol than a threat, daring someone to challenge him, to make him feel in control again. He stopped near the jury box, empty in this bench trial, and turned back toward the bench. His face was flushed. Sweat rolled down his brow. "You really think that voice of yours is going to change anything?" he said, almost laughing. "You think sounding calm makes you right?" Judge Rhodes didn't blink. "No," she said, leaning forward slightly. "But I think the people watching this, every viewer, every bystander, every person who thought you were just caught in a bad moment, they're watching now. And they're finally seeing the truth." Maddox opened his mouth to shout again, but for a moment, nothing came out. Outside, Detective Carla Nagoyan stepped quietly through the front doors of the courthouse. Behind her, SWAT officers were moving in calculated silence, up the stairs, into the hallways, weapons ready. Their steps made no noise. Their eyes were locked ahead. Inside the courtroom, time felt frozen. No one dared to speak. It no longer felt like a hall of justice, but like a room sealed under pressure. One wrong word, one wrong step, and it would all collapse. Maddox's eyes swept the space. From the front bench to the corner walls, he looked like a man watching everything slip away, trying to find something solid before the ground gave out. "You hear that?" he suddenly said, raising the weapon slightly. "That silence? That's the sound of a room finally learning how to listen." No one answered. He turned toward the audience, toward the lawyers, crouched low, the reporters huddled in fear, the clerk silently mouthing a prayer behind the desk. Someone's phone, hidden under the bench, now quietly recorded everything. "I spent 10 years putting criminals away," Maddox said, pacing again. 10 years chasing drug dealers, gang members, liars, and not once did anyone thank me. But the second some guy points a finger at me, suddenly I'm the villain? Judge Rhodes allowed the silence to sit before answering. "You weren't accused by one person," she said softly. "You were accused by a pattern." He stopped walking. There were reports, dozens, edited recordings, gaps in evidence. Each time you were given the benefit of the doubt, and each time you proved it was a mistake. His jaw locked. "I didn't come here for a lecture." "No," she said. "You came here for control, and now you're realizing you never really had it." His hand tightened on the grip, just a twitch, but enough to make a bailiff shift again. Still, Rhodes never looked away from him. "You want the truth?" she asked. "The badge didn't make you dangerous. It just let you believe you weren't." "I protected people," he shouted. "I showed up when others ran. I took the risks while people like you wrote opinions in wood-paneled rooms and called it bravery." "No," she replied. "What makes me brave is sitting here right now, looking at you, while you raise a weapon and choosing to answer with truth instead of fear." He tried to speak, but only his jaw moved. His lips parted, then froze again. What flashed across his face wasn't guilt. It wasn't even anger. It was confusion, like he didn't understand why none of his old tactics were working anymore. "I used to believe that people like you could change," Rhodes continued. "That maybe underneath the badge, there was something worth saving. But I watched your file grow year after year, and each time someone looked away, you became more certain that no one would ever call you to account." He stepped toward the bench again, heavier this time. "I said, shut up." "I won't," she answered. "Not here, not today. You don't get to decide who speaks. Not anymore." Outside, the SWAT team was in place. One team at the public gallery doors, another near the service entrance behind the clerk's hallway. Carla was at the front, one hand pressed against her headset, the other signaling her team to hold. She was listening, waiting for the moment that would make entry unavoidable. Inside, Maddox was starting to unravel. "You think that robe makes you powerful?" he muttered, his voice tighter now. "You think sitting up there gives you control? I've seen what happens when you push a man too far. I've been that man." Rhodes tilted her head, eyes calm. "And what did you find on the other side?" He looked at her, confused, off balance. He didn't answer, because somewhere deep down he knew. He looked at her, confused. "What did you find?" Judge Rhodes asked again. "After you crossed every line, ignored every rule, broke every oath, what did you actually find?" He didn't answer. "Did you find peace, justice, or just more excuses?" His head shook slowly, like the truth tasted bitter. "I found out who's really in charge," he muttered. "No," she replied. "You found out who finally stopped pretending you mattered more than everyone else." That made him flinch, just barely, but the mask cracked again. His breathing grew uneven, shallow, panicked in slow motion. His eyes scanned the room, but his focus was gone. And in that moment, the courtroom could finally see it. The rage wasn't righteous. The anger wasn't grounded. What stood there wasn't a protector of justice. It was a man terrified that the story he told himself was no longer being believed. "You don't know what I've seen," he whispered. "Maybe not," Rodas said, "but I know what you've done." For the first time since drawing the weapon, Maddox looked down, the gun still in his hand, but something in his stance began to break. His shoulders sagged, his balance shifted, and silence settled like snowfall. Not peaceful, just heavy. "You should be scared," he said, more to himself than to her. "No," Rhodes answered softly. "I should be angry that it took this, a weapon pointed at my head, for the world to finally see what you really are." Outside, Detective Carla Naguyan raised her hand. Just a breath away now. The SWAT team was positioned. The final signal was seconds out. Inside, Judge Rhodes didn't move. She didn't need to, because her voice, her resolve, her presence, it was already closing in around him. Tighter than walls, sharper than steel, there was rhythm in the silence now, like a heartbeat, but no one dared breathe to disturb it. Maddox stood alone, near the empty jury box, shoulders rising and falling with each breath. The weapon trembled, not from fear of action, but from fear of what came after. Outside, Carla moved like a shadow along the rear corridor. Her second unit lined up behind the clerk's door. The comms clicked in her ear, positions locked. She didn't blink, one hand on the door, the other counting time in her head. Inside, Maddox turned in a slow, sweeping circle, one final look at the people who once watched him command a courtroom. Now they lay pressed to the floor, terrified. "You all think this ends with me in cuffs?" he said, voice eerily calm. "You think they'll drag me out, slap a headline on it, and call it justice?" No one answered. Only one voice replied. "You're not the one who gets to write the ending," said Rodas. Maddox turned, eyes narrowed. "No," he muttered. "But maybe I still get the last word." He stepped forward. "I was supposed to be protected," he shouted. "I followed orders. I held the line. And for what? So judges like you could look down on me while the streets tore us apart?" "You were never asked to abuse your badge," Rodas said firmly. "But you chose to, and when you were offered a second chance, you used it to go further." His hand rose again, higher now, less steady. Outside, Carla lifted her hand. 3, 2, 1. She dropped it. The breach was immediate. Both doors burst open in synchronized violence. Wood cracked. Commands filled the air. "Drop the weapon! Get on the ground! Hands in the air!" SWAT officers flooded the room like a wave of precision. Rifles drawn, shields up. Every movement calculated to avoid disaster. Every shout echoing off stone walls. Maddox froze. Not out of fear, but from the sudden clarity of reality. This wasn't a standoff anymore. This was the end. He looked around, panicked, cornered. Officers closed in, weapons locked, voices commanding. He took one step back. "You think you win now?" he said, his voice cracking. Judge Rodas's rose from her seat, calm, straight-backed, unmoving. "This was never about winning," she said. "It's about ending something that should have ended a long time ago." And for 1 second, just one, he wavered. His shoulders lowered, his eyes dropped, the gun tilted down a few inches. But then, he looked at her, at the bench, at the woman who had refused to be shaken, and something inside him snapped. The weapon rose again, fast, reckless, final. He fired. The sound ripped through the courtroom like a thunderclap, louder than every command, sharper than any warning. It cut through the noise, pure and unmistakable. SWAT surged forward, but in that single breath, between the flash of light and the echo chasing it down, the only question anyone in that room could think of was, had she been hit? The smoke lingered. The courtroom held its breath. And then, Judge Rodas didn't fall. She didn't cry out. She didn't even flinch. She stood. The shot had missed, but the truth had landed. Don't miss the final conclusion in our next episode. Subscribe now, because the story isn't over. But Maddox's story is. Behind the bench, exactly where she had stood when the shot rang out, Judge Rodas remained upright, her robe untouched, her face unreadable. One of the bailiffs stepped toward her instinctively, panic beginning to rise, but stopped in his tracks when she slowly raised her hand. Not in fear, not in pain, but in control. "I'm fine," she said, and though her voice was softer now, it cut through the chaos like a clear command. He'd missed. Behind her, in the rich wood of the bench, a dark hole smoked quietly. Splinters scattered, the grain of the mahogany charred and cracked, just an inch to the left. And the outcome would have been irreversible. But it wasn't, and now it was over. There was no second shot. Before he could even process the recoil, an officer from the right flank slammed into Maddox with a shield, knocking him backward into the jury box. Another officer seized his weapon hand, forcing it upward. Two more were on him from behind in a second, driving him down with controlled force. There was no resistance. The fight had left him. His body hit the floor with a hollow thud, one arm pinned beneath a knee, the other wrenched behind him. The cuffs locked tight with a metallic snap. His weapon was kicked away across the floor, clattering and spinning, coming to rest beneath the prosecution's table. Detective Carla Naguyan stepped in last, just as the echo of chaos faded. She paused near the threshold, surveying the room. Her eyes found Judge Rodas, then dropped to Maddox, still breathing heavily into the polished floor. His voice silenced. His story finally stalled. "Suspect secured," came the call from a SWAT officer. "Medical team on standby," said another. Carla moved closer to the bench. "Judge Rodas," she asked carefully, "are you sure you're not hurt?" The judge gave a single nod. Her breath had steadied, "I'm sure." But when her eyes landed on the bullet hole, smoking, jagged, quiet, her hand hovered over it. Not trembling, not afraid, just present, a small moment of acknowledgement, like marking the place where the world had nearly come undone. Then she turned, scanning the room. The gallery was still crouched low, some behind benches, others near the walls. A reporter in the second row still had her phone raised, unaware her hand had locked in place. The court clerk was crying, quietly, trying to stifle the sound. A bailiff was reading names aloud, confirming who was safe. There was blood on the sleeve of a SWAT officer from where wood splinters had struck, but none of it was hers. And then Judge Rodas spoke again, not loud, not dramatic, but in a voice that instantly reclaimed the space. "Everyone may rise. The immediate danger has passed." Slowly, hesitantly, people began to move, like survivors stepping cautiously out of rubble, not sure what else might fall. Maddox had been pulled to his knees now, his face bruised from impact, his wrists bound tightly behind his back. He didn't look at anyone, didn't speak. The silence around him now wasn't stubbornness, it was emptiness. Judge Rodas stepped down from the bench. She didn't rush, she didn't falter. Each step was deliberate, heavier now, as if the weight she carried had changed, not broken her, but deepened her purpose. She stopped in front of him. He didn't lift his head, and she didn't offer him a word. Instead, she turned to Carla. "I want a full record pulled," she said. "Every complaint, every report he was tied to, even the ones that never made it to paper." "We're on it," Carla replied, voice low. "I've got 2 officers combing through internal files right now." "Good," Rodas said. "And I want eyes on every name that signed off on his performance reviews. Everyone who protected him. I'll make sure of it." Judge Rodas looked back toward the gallery. Reporters were already composing headlines in their heads. Some were shaking. Some were still stuck in disbelief. But she didn't speak to them. She wasn't addressing the court. She spoke to herself. "This isn't over," she said. "This is where it starts." And with that, she walked, past Maddox, past the smoldering illusion of control he once wrapped around himself, past the bench he thought would silence her. She stepped through the same door she had entered from at the beginning of the day. Only now, she wasn't just carrying a gavel. She was carrying the truth. And this time, the truth was going to make noise. The next day, the courthouse was quieter, but no one mistook that quiet for calm. Where once there had been whispers of a routine misconduct trial, there was now a storm. Flashing lights, press vans, headlines, and a line of courthouse staff who moved with a new kind of purpose, like people who had seen something they could know longer unsee. The front glass doors were smudged with the prints of camera crews and journalists desperate for a glimpse of the judge, of the man in custody, or of the story still unfolding. But Judge Rodas didn't enter through the front that morning. She came through the side, head lowered, coat buttoned, a plain folder tucked beneath her arm. No robe, no escort, just quiet focus. Inside the folder were 20 pages. The beginning of Officer Brent Maddox's internal record. What little of it had ever been made official. Redacted complaints, suspended reviews, a handful of reports marked resolved, but never investigated. What began as a trial was now a reckoning. Subscribe to see what comes next. Because what was hidden is now coming to light, and the truth doesn't flinch. There wasn't enough yet to build a full case, but there was enough to confirm what she already suspected. Someone had been protecting him. Judge Rodas stepped into her chambers and quietly shut the door behind her. The overhead light buzzed with a soft electric whine, a sound she usually tuned out, but now it was all she could hear. The wall clock clicked forward. 1 second, then another, and another. She sat at her desk and opened the folder. The first report was from 2014, 8 years earlier. A traffic stop. A 17-year-old boy hospitalized with a fractured eye socket and broken ribs. No video. Complaint dismissed in 3 days. The officer who reviewed it? Captain Roland Bowers, now retired. Once praised for making internal affairs efficient and quiet. The next file, 2016. Body cam missing. Call was for domestic disturbance. The excuse? Equipment malfunction. She scribbled a note in the margin. Check equipment logs. Third entry, 2018. Anonymous complaint from inside the department. It alleged Maddox routinely escalated stops against black residents, altered evidence, and filed misleading reports. It was unsigned. No follow-up, no investigation. She stared at that page longer than the others. Then she picked up the phone. "Get me Tiffany Hall," she told her clerk. "Tell her I'm ready to talk." Tiffany Hall had covered courthouse stories for years, but this was the first time the judge had ever called her. She arrived with her notebook in hand and her phone already recording. "This isn't for headlines," Rodas said immediately. "This isn't a press statement. I want the full record built, everything public, everything hidden. Timeline, names, details, all of it." Tiffany sat, wide-eyed. "I've already started pulling the older reports," she said. "There are patterns, but it's hard to see them without what's sealed." "I have some of it," Rodas replied. "And I'm going to get the rest." Tiffany hesitated. "The department's not just going to open its doors. They won't have a choice," the judge said. "Not after what happened. Not with this much attention now." By the end of the day, the back wall of her chambers was filled. Complaint numbers, dates, names, blank spaces where missing reports should be, and red lines connecting the same supervisors, the same internal reviewers, the same investigators who marked case after case, no action needed. A pattern began to emerge. Not loud, but clear. A silent network of hands that knew how to make problems disappear. Detective Carla Naguyan arrived in the evening. She dropped another file on the desk. "I brought everything we could access without a warrant," she said, "and it's worse than I expected." Rhodes looked up. Go on. There are relocations, quiet ones. Whenever things got too loud, Maddox was moved. No discipline, just reassignment. 3 precincts in 5 years, each one farther from scrutiny. She opened the folder. There are letters in his file, she said, but they're decorative. They were never meant to stick. Rhodes stood and faced the board. Flag everyone connected to his reviews. Supervisors, field trainers, investigators. I want their files opened. Cross-check them with every complaint they ever touched. I'll get started, Carla said, then paused. But if you go public with this, Judge, you're going to make powerful enemies. Fast. I'm not afraid of enemies, Rhodes replied. I'm afraid of silence. Carla looked at her, then simply nodded and left. The judge remained alone, facing the wall of red lines, old dates, and invisible signatures. The hole in the bench had already been patched, but the image lingered. How close it had come, how deeply it all had been buried, how long this system had helped keep it quiet. She didn't feel victorious. She felt awake, because this wasn't just about one man anymore. This was about every unchecked signature, every review rubber-stamped, every moment the system handed him a badge and looked the other way. Now, she was going to bring it all into the light. One name, one file, one silence at a time. The holding facility sat just outside the city, past the courthouse, beyond the rows of silent government buildings that always looked emptier than they really were. The structure itself was unremarkable. Beige walls, narrow windows, barbed wire coiled above a high chain-link fence. Inside, it was a place built not for punishment, but for time to stretch, until it wore a person down. Judge Rhodes didn't come with an escort. No cameras, no security detail. Just a folder in one hand, and that same steady calm that had carried her through every step so far. The officer at the gate didn't ask questions. He didn't have to. Everyone inside already knew why she was there. Maddox was waiting in the visitor's room, cuffed at one wrist to a steel bracket bolted into the floor. Standard issue beige, unshaven, shoulders slouched. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It no longer sat on the surface. It had sunk deeper, harder to reach and harder to escape. When she stepped through the door, he looked up, and for the first time, he didn't speak. This wasn't about justice served. It was about everything that allowed it to be denied, until now. Subscribe for the final chapter. Because the truth didn't end in that courtroom. It started there. He twisted his face into something that might have once passed for a smile, but his eyes, they were cold, empty. Well, he said. The great Vanessa Rhodes. Come to enjoy the view? She took a seat across from him without flinching. I don't come to gloat. Sure, he chuckled darkly. You're the noble type, the judge in the robe, here to show everyone how brave you are. She opened the folder in front of her, but didn't look at it yet. You know you're going away for a long time. He leaned back, limited by the chain that cuffed one wrist to the steel bracket on the floor. His free hand rested on the table, motionless. You think I don't know how this ends? He said. They'll lock me away, throw the key in the ocean, turn me into the face of every bad headline, like I built the system myself. You didn't build it, she said, but you thrived in it, and now you're going to help expose it. He scoffed. You think I'm going to help you? I don't need your help, she replied. I have your file. I have every disciplinary report, every supervisor who signed off on your behavior, every complaint that was buried, every name that looked away. She leaned in slightly, and there next. Maddox tilted his head again, grinning without warmth. So that's your mission now? Big cleanup job? Wipe the whole slate? He paused. But you and I both know the truth, Judge. Nobody really wants the slate clean. They just want to feel better while the dirt stays buried. That might have been true before, she said. But the moment you pulled that weapon, you changed that. He leaned forward, cuff-scraping metal as he moved. You act like I'm the problem, but I was the solution. You think those streets were calm because of community programs? They were calm because I made them calm. You didn't protect people, she said quietly. You controlled them. You escalated fear until someone got hurt. And even now you call that order? He smirked again, voice colder. You don't belong on that bench. You never did. You got there because of politics. Let's not pretend otherwise. Affirmative action in a robe. That's all this ever was. She didn't blink. You're trying to insult me, but all you're doing is confirming what we already knew. You didn't hate my rulings. You hated me before I ever spoke. Damn right, he said, because people like you don't understand what it means to be out there, what it means to be the only thing between law and chaos. You were the chaos, she answered, and now the world will finally see it. He stared at her, jaw clenched. She opened the folder, calmly laying out the pages, copies of old internal reviews, black and white photographs, sworn statements from whistleblowers whose words had been ignored until now. Your department's review board was compromised, she said. 2 of your supervisors quietly retired after complaints were filed. One still collecting a pension, another left the state. He looked at the documents but said nothing. They're next, she continued. Every name linked to your record, every officer who ignored what you did or helped cover it up, they're all going to answer for it. Big words, he muttered. Not words, she said. Process. He shook his head slowly. For the first time, the weight of it seemed to settle in. You really think this changes anything? It already has, she replied. You were once a man who thought the badge made you untouchable. Now you're just another man in a holding cell. He laughed, but even he heard how thin it sounded. You want the truth, Judge? He said, lowering his voice. Why I really did it. Why I lost it. He looked at her now, not with anger, but with something more broken. It wasn't about the case. It wasn't about justice. I just couldn't stand being judged by someone like you. You, sitting up there like you earned it. She stood, folding the folder under her arm. I did earn it, she said. And now I'm going to earn something else. Real accountability. Not just for you, but for every man who nodded along with you. Every one of them who thought your hate was just part of the job. She turned and walked toward the door. You'll never clean it all up, he called after her. It's too big, too deep. She paused, glanced back. Then I'll dig deeper. And she left him there, cuffed to a table, surrounded by silence. The same silence he once mistook for control, now collapsing around him. 3 days later, the story broke. It wasn't flashy. There were no dramatic headlines, no caps lock or scandal-laced quotes, just a clean, precise article by Tiffany Hall, published on the front page of the city's leading digital outlet. And it opened with a question. How does a man with 12 misconduct complaints, 3 use of force allegations, and half a dozen missing video files stay in uniform for over a decade? The answer didn't come in speculation. It came in facts, in real names, real dates, and the quiet, damning patterns of a system designed not to correct, but to conceal. The article didn't focus on Brent Maddox himself. It focused on the pattern, the chain. One supervisor had quietly retired and moved out of state. Another had been promoted, reassigned after a mysterious internal audit, records of which could no longer be located. Internal Affairs had failed to escalate at least 5 of the most serious incidents involving Maddox. Some of those cases had never even reached formal review. At first, the public reaction was quiet, cautious. But by midday, the story had spread far beyond Charleston. By evening, Judge Rhodes's office had received over 24 inquiries from state officials, legal analysts, and national journalists asking if a formal inquiry had been opened. She didn't answer. Not yet, because she'd already begun. The wall in her chambers had transformed. What started as a basic sketch had grown into something much larger, a network of names, photographs, performance records, and disciplinary memos. Red lines traced the movements of key players, chiefs, commanders, union reps. The deeper she looked, the clearer the pattern became. Maddox wasn't the root, he was just the part the public could see. The real problem was underneath, an entire framework designed not to uphold justice, but to avoid consequences. Carla stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes locked on the board. "We found the clearance memo from the 2018 traffic stop," she said. "The one where Maddox slammed that teen into the sidewalk." "They said the body cam malfunctioned," Rhodes replied. "It didn't," Carla said. "The footage was flagged as non-essential before the system auto-synced. That flag created a delay." "A loophole," Rhodes murmured. "How many others used it?" "Too many," Carla replied. "But the approvals all lead back to one name, Captain James Keller." Rhodes's eyes narrowed. "I've seen his name 3 times this week." 4, Carla corrected. "We found another this morning." Rhodes stepped back, looking at the board. The red lines all bent toward Keller, his signature again and again, closing cases that never should have been closed. Her eyes shifted to another section, emails that Tiffany Hall had recovered. Scanned copies of internal communications between precinct leaders. They didn't talk about justice. They talked about optics, about liability, about headlines. And then there it was. One line, printed in black. "If Maddox makes another mistake, we need to get ahead of it this time." They hadn't missed it. They'd anticipated it. That afternoon, Tiffany returned, this time with a flash drive and a different look in her eyes. "I've got 3 more," she said, sitting without waiting for permission. 2 are still on active duty. One's a retired dispatcher who says she was ordered to reroute complaint calls back in 2017. "And they all say the same thing?" Rhodes asked. Tiffany nodded. "It wasn't just about Maddox. It was policy. It was protection." "Can they testify?" "Eventually," Tiffany said. "They're watching now. They want to see if anyone actually gets held accountable." "They will," Rhodes replied, "starting now." That evening, she drafted a formal request to the State Commission overseeing judicial and law enforcement conduct. She named 5 officers, current staff, all placed under recommended administrative hold pending further review. Keller was at the top of the list. The attached evidence, a pattern of sign-offs, systemic dismissal of complaints, and refusal to act on clear early warning reports. She didn't copy the department heads. She sent it directly and silently. The next morning, a terse response arrived from the district attorney's office. "This request is premature. The officer in question is not under criminal investigation. Internal review should precede external action." She read it twice, then deleted it. Later that day, she entered a closed-door meeting with District Attorney Leonard Price, a man known for his cautious suits, his deliberate tone, and a career built on always being one step ahead of the fallout. "I've seen your memo," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. "I'm not here to ask permission," Rhodes replied. "Vanessa," he said, leaning forward, "you're making a lot of noise, going public with internal issues, requesting files without following standard protocol. It's going to become political." "It already is political," she said, "and if you had listened when I flagged Maddox's record last year, we wouldn't be here now." He sighed, slow, calculated. "You're pushing this too fast." "No," she said, standing. "I'm moving exactly at the speed justice requires." and she walked out without waiting for his reply. Outside his office, her clerk handed her a printed copy of Tiffany's latest article. The headline was simple: "Not just one badge, how a city protected its worst officers." It had already been shared over 15,000 times, and by the end of the day, a state oversight committee had announced a formal public hearing. The circle was tightening. And Judge Rodas? She was just getting started. The hearing room at the state capitol wasn't built for public attention. Faded flags, crooked seal, a chamber better suited for quiet resolutions. But not today. By noon, every seat was filled. Lines stretched down the hallway. Reporters, lawyers, citizens, and survivors, there to witness what had been hidden for years, because this wasn't just a case anymore, it was a reckoning. And the person leading it wasn't asking permission. She was writing the record herself. Subscribe for the final chapter. Because silence protected the system, but truth is about to dismantle it. Outside the state capitol, camera crews balanced tripods on top of one another. Reporters checked mics, stepped over cables, and called in updates. But they weren't the only ones there. Families began arriving. Some had been ignored for years. Some had long since given up hope. Now, they came holding old photos and yellowing paperwork, documents that no one in power had ever taken seriously until now. Judge Rodas's wasn't behind the bench this time. She sat in the front row, not as a judge, but as a citizen. She hadn't asked to speak. She didn't need to. The voices that followed her work were finally being heard. The first speaker was a mother. Her son had been arrested at 16 during a traffic stop involving Maddox and another officer still on active duty. She described how the police report didn't match her son's medical records, how body cam footage was never returned, how her official complaint was closed in less than 2 weeks, labeled insufficient evidence. She held up the hospital photos. She didn't cry. The second witness was a retired patrol officer, small-framed, quiet-spoken, but his words didn't waver. He had worked 2 precincts away from Maddox, and he described how officers were coached to avoid formal documentation, how complaints were filtered through a liaison, then quietly redirected into a review process designed to keep problems hidden. His voice cracked once, only once, when he admitted to missing a call from a grieving family, a call he had avoided because he didn't know what to say. By the time the fourth witness took the stand, the room had grown completely still. She had been an admin clerk in internal affairs. She brought emails, signed reports, and an audio file, 2 department leaders on record discussing how to hide a misconduct case by reassigning it to a different officer's file. No one interrupted. No one dared. When the session ended, the committee called a recess. And the chairwoman, a calm, soft-spoken official from Columbia who rarely commented during hearings, asked to meet privately with Judge Rhodes. They met in a side room, away from the noise, away from the press. "You've shaken something loose," the chair said, "and now it's coming apart faster than any of us expected." "It needed to," Rhodes replied. "There are names on these files we didn't even realize were still active," the chair continued. "Supervisors collecting pensions, officers now working in training programs. If even half of this holds up in legal review..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "This isn't just misconduct," she said. "It's coordinated. A structure. Then treat it like one," Rhodes said. The chair nodded slowly. "We'll start with subpoenas, Keller's records first. Then the union officials who cleared his sign-offs," Rhodes added, "and every precinct chief who reassigned Maddox instead of removing him. If we move in the right order," she continued, "they'll fold." That night, Rhodes stood again before the wall in her chambers. More documents had been added, some printed from Carla's investigation, others from the mayor's office, now under review for ignoring civil rights complaints. On the corner of the whiteboard, Tiffany Hall had taped a draft of her next article. Its headline was plain: How the City Paid to Stay Quiet. And the subheadline told the rest: 32 settlements, nearly $3 million, and a silence clause in every one. Rhodus exhaled slowly. Her eyes moved across the wall, not just to the names of officers, but to the names of people who had suffered quietly while the system protected itself. She thought of the court clerk who sat frozen the day Maddox pulled a weapon, of the mother who held her son's medical photos like evidence no court had ever accepted, of the patrol officer who once called Maddox a liability and was quietly pushed into a desk job for saying it aloud. These weren't just whispers anymore. The microphone was on, and people were finally listening. The next morning, the call came from the governor's office. It was brief, polite, carefully worded. "We'd like to schedule a briefing." Rhodus didn't ask why. She already knew. Later that day, 3 department heads announced early retirements. Internal Affairs suspended all open disciplinary reviews, and a statement was issued. An external audit would be conducted by an independent task force. The union released its own message, calling for procedural fairness and respect for officers who serve honorably. But the public response was louder. Outside City Hall, a quiet protest had formed. It wasn't angry, it was focused. People carried signs, no slogans, just names of those arrested, injured, ignored, names the system had tried to bury. Rhodus watched from her office window, arms crossed, expression still. She had never wanted attention, never sought headlines. What she wanted, what she still wanted, was accountability. And now, finally, it was coming. Not with fireworks, not with a verdict, but with unraveling. And she wasn't finished. The hearing room was full again, but this time, it wasn't just journalists and families. Now there were suits, pressed, formal, tense, because what started as one case had become something else entirely. Subscribe to see how it ends, because what they buried is being dug up, and this time, it won't be covered over again. Outside the state capitol, the air was thick with anticipation. Camera crews jockeyed for space. Tripods leaned against one another like scaffolding, and reporters spoke in urgent tones as they checked sound levels. But this crowd wasn't just press. Families stood among them, some ignored for years, others long forgotten, holding faded documents and photographs that had once meant nothing to those in charge, until now. Judge Vanessa Rhodus entered quietly. No robe, no jewelry, just a black suit and the calm authority of someone who didn't need introduction. She took her seat at the front, not to rule, but to listen. The silence that followed wasn't mandated. It was earned. The committee chair welcomed her back. "We understand you've submitted additional materials," she said. "Would you like to summarize?" Rhodes didn't reach for notes. "I've submitted documentation connecting 8 officers to falsified reports, 5 supervisors to misconduct files that were never independently reviewed, and 2 assistant DAs who approved dismissals without informing the complainants." She paused, then added, "All of it ties back to Officer Brent Maddox, but none of it ends with him." Her gaze shifted, landing directly on District Attorney Leonard Price. "Your office received formal notice of misconduct tied to Maddox almost a year ago. You acknowledged it, then dismissed it. Since that dismissal, we've uncovered redacted footage, settlement agreements with confidentiality clauses, and emails showing how complaints were worded to limit exposure." Price sat still, fingers folded neatly, trying to look unaffected. The chair turned to him. "Mr. Price, would you like to respond?" He leaned into the mic, voice careful. "Our office takes these matters seriously. If internal reviews failed, that is a concern we will address." Rhodes didn't wait. "You didn't address it when it mattered. Not when we flagged patterns. Not when community groups brought evidence. You waited until a weapon was drawn in a courtroom and your department could no longer stay in the shadows. I understand your frustration. No, she said, you don't. Frustration is when someone ignores your voice. What people lived through was abandonment. The room didn't shift. It watched. The chair asked her next question directly. Would you support a full independent review of every case tied to the officers you've named? Yes, Rhodes said without hesitation. And I recommend suspending all internal review authority within the department until that audit is complete. That's a drastic measure. What happened in that courtroom was drastic. What allowed it to happen was worse. The gavel fell for recess, but no one left the room. More witnesses followed. An assistant DA described pressure to dismiss civil rights complaints unless they presented immediate liability. A precinct commander admitted that officers with patterns of misconduct were quietly moved instead of reported. By day's end, 2 immediate actions were taken: a freeze on new hires within the police department until training practices could be reviewed, a formal demand for the resignation of Captain James Keller, and an ethics investigation into the DA's inaction. That evening, Tiffany Hall stood outside the courthouse. Today, accountability gained a name, she said on camera. Not just Brent Maddox, but those who enabled him, protected him, and ignored every warning sign. Inside her office, Rhodes sat reviewing transcripts. Carla entered with a folder in hand. It's moving fast, she said. The union warned its members of possible department-wide review. The commissioner is testifying next week. 3 more officers retired today. Rhodes didn't smile. This isn't a cleanup, she said. It's exposure. The real work hasn't even started. The next morning, a clerk brought news. A late-night, unrecorded meeting had taken place between the DA, the deputy commissioner, and 2 aides from the mayor's office. They weren't discussing reform. They were discussing narrative stabilization, translation, containment. But the momentum didn't slow. The crowds grew, threefold. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not shouting, not breaking, just present, unmoving, unyielding. Inside her chambers, Rhodes prepared for the most visible hearing yet. The university auditorium had been selected to hold the public demand. Every seat filled before the hour. Every stairwell lined with people. Every exit guarded, not to control the crowd, but to protect the process. The commissioner spoke first. He read from a statement filled with numbers, reforms, projections, policy timelines. He never used the word failure. He never said Maddox's name. When he finished, Rhodes stood. She didn't carry notes. There's a reason people don't trust numbers anymore, she began. For years, officials used them to bury the truth. They measured success by how fast a case closed, not whether it was resolved. They measured safety by how quiet the headlines stayed, not by how deep the damage ran. She laid a folder on the podium. Inside were leaked memos, buried grievances, names. She read one aloud, a complaint filed 6 years earlier by a fellow officer. It had been reassigned, marked resolved, then buried. You didn't resolve the truth, she said. You avoided it. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was long. When asked what came next if her recommendations were approved, Rhodes didn't look at the officials. She looked at the crowd. Teachers, nurses, transit workers, veterans, students, survivors. We rebuild, she said, with the truth as the foundation this time. That evening, her phone rang. A senator from Washington. A national task force was being formed. They wanted her insight. She didn't say yes, not right away. She stood by the window, watching the city in the amber light. And when she finally spoke, her answer was clear. Send me the details. Weeks later, the courtroom looked the same, but it felt different. The same benches, the same wood, the same quiet. But now the silence felt earned, not imposed. Brent Maddox stood at the defense table. No badge, no allies, no illusion of control. The verdict? Guilty on all counts. The city didn't cheer. It didn't rage, it moved. Outside, teachers gathered signatures for new community boards. Advocates handed out flyers on citizen rights. Volunteers met residents in the same place where protests once stood. It wasn't finished, but it had begun. Back inside, Rodas reviewed the final draft of the Civilian Oversight Charter. This time, the language was different. No loopholes, no vague promises, just clarity, just truth. When asked to speak in other cities, Chicago, Baltimore, LA, she only said, "I'll think about it." Later that week, she walked through the park. A group of high schoolers handed out flyers. One looked up and recognized her. "You're the judge, right?" Rodas nodded. "Thanks for not backing down," the girl said. "We're studying your hearings in civics class." Rodas smiled. "Make sure they teach you the full story, not just the verdict." "They are," the girl replied. "Our teacher says justice isn't about the result, it's about who keeps standing." Rodas paused. "Then you've got a good teacher." That evening, the courthouse lights came on. The same stone steps, the same high walls. But the people who passed through them, they weren't the same anymore. Because this time, the cracks had been named, and the rebuilding had begun from the inside out. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Because truth isn't loud, but once it begins, it doesn't stop.